The pug sniffed my shoe and began to drool like they do just before they bite. I eased my foot away. It growled. The old woman's bright gaze fastened on mine. So you see him? See him. The conversation had moved on. The pierced man was saying, whole left side went cold from the armpit down. Now it's numb. The neuro won't say if the feeling will come back. Mostly it does, he said. For most people. Most of the time. The old woman lifted her chin at me. I'm the oldest person in the world with MS, she said, as though we were only people in the room. Most folks die right around pension time. Just give up, lay down, and die. Not me. I'm 91. I know some things. So you listen to me. The rest talked on determinedly. But God never sends you anything you can't handle. Amen. See Matt? She nodded at the pierced man. See that fire over his head? Matt heard. He twitched as though he had almost reached up to check, and for a second I thought I saw orange flame coiling over his hair like a nest of snakes. I blinked again. Doily brains get that glow right around the time they start to tremble. He'll be trembling soon. You can hear it in his voice sometimes. Then they forget their names, or tell you a story for the 28th time, or they run their fancy chairs straight into the wall. There's nothing a good attitude can't fix. She nodded as though I'd said yes, and scratched under her chestnut-colored wig with a bony finger. Yours now. Yours ain't a small dog. Not flame, neither. Never seen anything like it, or great grinning thing. Grinning thing. Nothing made sense. It was too hot, and too many people were talking at once. Kind to the world, and the world will be kind right back. You scared? You should be. It's aiming to kill you, and I doubt you'll stop it. My name's Ray. I'm an author, writer of horror, fantasy, and sometimes sci-fi, an overall nerd. I game an unhealthy amount. I'm disabled. Welcome to my first video. Introduction. Stock video essayist disclaimers. What I'm presenting here is based in my experiences and opinions, and if you don't agree with that, it's fine. I can't tell you how to live. What I can do is tell you how I live as a disabled person and the insights that those experiences give me on a beautifully written novella, and tell you everything that it meant to me. So Lucky is a novella written by Nicola Griffith and published in 2018. It's categorized as autobiographical fiction dealing with life change events. Or in more direct terms, it's a story of Mara Tagarelli, a woman on top of the world who loses her job, wife, and hobbies when she's diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, or MS for short. Over the course of the story, Mara grapples with a specific brand of helpless rage, known best by those of us who are suddenly thrust into what feels like a war with our own bodies. Under the threat of looming danger, both psychological and very, very real, Mara struggles to build herself a new life in this whole new world order. The beauty of this story is that in the midst of a cohesive, compelling narrative, it manages to present the realities of being disabled in a way that's not preachy, without stopping to over-explain things, and without pulling its punches. Over the course of this video, I'm going to read excerpts of the book So Lucky by Nicola Griffith. While I may leave out parts and skip around in some passages, that is solely in the interest of maintaining focus on the particular elements I want to discuss, and of reducing quote bloat. All cited passages will include page numbers as accurate to the physical copy of the book. Now, Griffith tells Mara's story not in chapters, but in vignettes and bite-sized chunks of scenes ranging from a single paragraph to a handful of pages. Going back through it, the longest I could find was 8 pages, giving the story a punchy pace that's always right in the action and reality of the protagonist. We're perceiving not only people and events the way she is, but time as well. When she's blurring through in a disassociated state haze, so are we, skimming through scant details and stripped paragraphs that span months of her life in just a few turns of the page. When despair makes time stretch into an infinity, or a moment of peace closes off the awareness of the outside world, we stay with that for several pages. The intimacy of the pacing makes it both easier and harder to read, as the narrative compels you forward through what is admittedly a raw and real experience of being disabled in the US. The autobiographical element becomes apparent when you read the author's bio on the back of the book. Nicola Griffith is a one-time self-defense instructor who turned to writing full-time upon being diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. One might ask in this instance, why fictionalize it at all? If this is the story she wants to tell, why not just make it a memoir? Well, I don't know, but I have a guess. Disabled people are usually ignored, but good stories aren't. So, let's talk about the story. Spoiler warnings for all major events of the plot. Plot. My original description may have been a tad misleading. Though Mara does lose her job and hobby because of MS, we start the story with her wife already leaving her. Mara watches her wife, Rose, drive away, and then turns and trips on nothing as she walks back to the house. A slippery leaf, she thinks, or an uneven bit of driveway. She should really get that fixed. Later, Mara talks and drinks with her best friend Diana. They're dancing around what they actually feel, or at least Mara is, with requests for more wine that turn into flirting, that turn into a night in bed. But it's not as joyful as it could be before or after. Ayana's leaving for New Zealand in only a few weeks, leaving Mara alone. No Rose, no Ayana. And then, when Ayana makes a farewell trip to her family in another state, Mara falls in her kitchen in the middle of the night. Her legs won't work, and she can't get up, and she has no idea why. A serene, impersonal doctor tells her in a stripped, sanitary room that she has MS. Mara reacts to her MS by going into research mode, which mood is exactly what I've done with everything that's ever gone wrong with my body. She is an educated professional, and her natural instinct is to educate herself about this. So, all alone, she looks up statistics about this disease. Mortality rates of MS sufferers, as the papers call them. Employment rates of sufferers. Statistically, she'll be out of a job within 5 years. Statistically, she'll be dead by 65. She thinks about calling Ayana, but... I should call Ayana. She was the one who knew about brains, but sufferer. Victim. That was not what I wanted her to see when she looked at me. At work, she's in full budget-setting grind. She is almost the top position an AIDS nonprofit has, and they rely on her for meticulous and often ruthless work. Yet now she can't focus. She's irritated when her personal assistant presents all of the relevant information for the day. She can tell the heating kicked on, and lines run through her head about the core temperature of people with MS and symptom exacerbation. Her body is buzzing with strange pins and prickles. She cancels her appointments and goes home. Now, I won't be going through every aspect of the story beat by beat, but the setup is important here. A critical aspect of disability is the psychological. While it often feels like these symptoms pop up out of nowhere, more often than not, it's during a time of incredible stress. Like a malicious, sadistic monster, our invisible illness reaches out in our weakest moments to make them all worse. Anything from semester finals to a broken relationship can do it. And then we fall, crash, and have to learn to cope with everything when it's already in pieces. Mara tries a lot of things. While her doctor sets her up with an IV and medications for the side effects of the medications, she incessantly researches and tries to keep working. That doesn't last for long, though. A budget report written in a rage includes the words, "You and the horse you rode in on." Unsurprisingly, she's let go. She tries a support group, but an old lady tells her that her MS is a great, grinning thing that's aiming to kill her. Unsurprisingly, she doesn't go back. Her rage spirals. Since she has the skills, she starts a new nonprofit, Cripples Action Team, or CAT, for MS people, by MS people. She travels, gives talks, and when people on her nonprofit's mailing list start getting robbed and dying, in a perfect line across the states, directly towards her, she spends hours a day calling and going to the police. The FBI, no one believes her. No one is anything but patronizing. She sees a monster in the shadows. She gets sick and collapses on a trip to speak at the National Disability Coalition. More people die. No one listens. Not until so many have died. Mara's ex-wife, either believing her or simply willing to be the support she desperately needs, takes her to live at her guest bedroom for a while. It's only then that Mara starts to slow down and get a moment of peace. She rests, and she talks to someone she knows about the things that she's feeling. It's not all work and grind and anger, and it helps. Eventually, she goes home. The detective she's been hounding has contacted her to tell her that they believe her now, that they're tracking people moving from place to place and targeting people with MS. From here, something is different. And while she does work, she also joins a yoga course for people with MS. She reaches out to Ayana, who hasn't been talking to her for a while, and she takes a consulting job for a lot of money with the nonprofit that fired her in the first place. Isn't that just poetic?
The new normal.
There's a concept among the disabled community called the new normal. Actually, it's a concept that's used across a lot of subjects, from health to economics to safety, that describes a change into a state of being after a crisis that's different than what came before it. The crisis, well, the chaotic, intense change part of it is over, but nothing will ever be the same. Think Frodo. After destroying the ring and saving everything, being absolutely unable to return to his old way of life. In Western society, in the US, we're taught to value productivity, health, sort of. No need to go into that right now. Money, hard work, and individual success. Humans are more or less worthy based on how well they fulfill these values. Well, health is already out the window, isn't it? Disability makes it downright impossible to do certain things without the support of others on both micro and macro levels, so that covers individual success. And as for hard work, productivity, and money, well, grind culture is a good way to end up in the hospital. We see it with Mara, who desperately clings to the old normal and the old pace her body used to work at. While working to get her new, impulsively created non-profit off the ground, Mara flies all across the country to speak at conferences. Her friends and doctors tell her to slow down. Her ex-wife even sits her down to tell her she needs to stop. But she has this looping reel in the back of her mind about holes in her brain and limbs that don't work, and passages from textbooks on MS filled with derogatory language. You see, a critical source of her rage throughout the book is the shame that she hasn't and can't grapple with. Shame from being broken. Shame from being less than. Shame from being unable to do the things that make a human worth something. Victim. Sufferer. And she can't stop working. She wants to make a difference, yes, but it's more than that. She is compelled to make sure that she is still worth something. She needs to prove that she can still fulfill these values: work, productivity, money. And she continues until she collapses at one of the conferences and doesn't wake up for 3 days. She nearly dies because of this part of her that can't accept how things have changed. For disabled people, the new normal is the reality that we must accept after the trauma of disability. Whether it's an overnight change or a slow deterioration, almost every disabled person on the planet experiences the dramatic shift between just going about their lives and realizing that we are at war with our own bodies. Every way we relate to ourselves and the world has to change. We have to manage our physical needs and abilities differently. We have to accept new ways to handle social situations, and we have to align our self-worth with values often contrary to mainstream society. We have to accept what we've lost, that we have really lost it.
Vulnerability.
Make no mistake, the development of disability itself is a trauma. Not just the event, if there was one, that preceded or caused it. Trauma is, when boiled down, what happens to us when we realize that we aren't as fundamentally safe in our worlds as we originally believed we were. It's the wound, the literal injury, in which "I am not safe" is written in our neurons. Disability writes these words in ways both simple and complex, glaring and subtle. Impressively, So Lucky outlines almost all of them I can think of. There's the raw physical knowledge that others can simply overpower you if they want to. Small actions, such as when people move our wheelchairs when and where we don't want, don't do that, by the way, do not touch people's wheelchairs, become violent reminders of our impotence.
I got through the fear the first time, forced myself to see that I could fight back, that I wasn't helpless, even though everything told me I was. But now I'm going through it all again because now I am helpless. Now I can't even run away.
Stewing in that mire of fear and helplessness, anything can become a threat in our minds. So Lucky shows us this too, in a way. Mara is reactive in a bar scene, hurting someone because she assumes a man talking to a drunk woman is going to, Turns out the guy was the woman's husband, just getting her home.
But thankfully, Griffith avoids painting us as paranoid simpletons who should be ignored. I mean, the world already does that enough. As serial killers move their way across the states, Mara's instinctual fear leads to some very real answers. She connects the dots. First, that they are targeting people they know are vulnerable, people with MS. Second, they seem to know who has MS. Third, that every person in their path, as the death count builds, is on a nonprofit mailing list that Mara herself put together, the one for her nonprofit. By the third attack, there is a clear pattern. But do the authorities take her seriously? No. She calls in her connections to the police force. They close those connections quick. She goes to the local police station and calls their public lines. They tell her they'll take it under advisement, and then go silent. All of them seem to feel the need to ask if she has MS too when she talks about the hate crime killings. Oh, you have MS? Oh, okay. You're just seeing things that aren't there because the victims are like you. Finally, when the killings cross state lines, Mara resolves to contact the FBI. But their tip line is infuriatingly limited.
I imagined the old woman getting ornery. Maybe that's what it took. I could do that. I called back, and again, but it was hard to stay coherent in such small bits. The copy was beginning to work. I thought for a bit, then wrote a whole story in 250-word chunks, complete with an introduction with my name and contact info, and the subject matter: hate crime murders across state lines, and the fact that I would be leaving multiple messages, each numbered and in order. I timed them, rewrote some bits, then I called 11 times and read, enunciating clearly until I had given them every last detail. It might be a waste of time. Most probably they would not even call back. I knew how it would go if they did. A grown woman left her house, and you expect us to do what exactly, ma'am? Nothing. They would do nothing because no one ever did. They just watched, glad it wasn't them. And often they could not see the thing that pursued us. Perhaps they did not believe it existed. But I had to try.
So why am I highlighting this? I have to be honest, there's a little part of me that resonates with this so hard, I just want it to be seen. How tedious was this moment? How much time and effort did it take to gather the information, organize it, test it, rewrite it, test again? I mean, listen, I'm a writer. I understand the physical and mental energy that goes into making sure the words you say are coherent. This is hours worth of work, even for someone experienced, and Mara does it all knowing that she probably won't be listened to. It's inspiring, you might want to say. It's crushing, more like. I admire each and every one of us who manages to keep up that sort of energy. And hell, it's worth it when you're trying to save lives. But it also chips away at our spirit. Just imagine all that work every time we need someone to take us seriously. Every time we need help. Fear's pretty motivating though. And she does help, in the end. The FBI eventually calls her to update her on the situation and get her information. Again, all the same things she already said, but at least they're listening now. Eventually the men are caught and stopped, and they find out that it's actually not her mailing list that they're using, but actually one from an organization that she joined in her initial search for a supportive community. She's safe from them, and moreover, it wasn't her fault. But I couldn't help but think as I read this resolution, when's the next person gonna pick up a list? When will the next people decide to target the vulnerable?
Empowerment.
We walk impossible lines between accepting the status quo to care for ourselves and fighting to change things at the detriment of our own physical health. In a way, we have to martyr ourselves in order to make a difference for people like us. You'd think the obvious answer would be to stop and do everything to be healthy as an individual, but it's not as simple as it seems. In So Lucky, Mara was fired for having MS. Well, no, that wouldn't be legal, would it? No, she's fired for the time off and the slip in quality of work as a result of her MS. Granted, one of those slip-ups was writing "you and the horse you rode in on" in a budget report she sent to the board. Fair enough. But let's back up to what happened right before all that. Mara calls the board chair, Erin, to discuss something she overlooked back when she was just another abled person walking around.
A new ramp is not in the budget at this time. It should be. The executive committee feels the sidewalk remediation would cost too much.
I'll find a way to raise the money. We need our ED focused on strategic issues, not details. The muscle under my eye twitched. I flexed my face hideously to make it stop. Disabled people are not details. The current ramp is ADA compliant. It's round the back, like a service entrance. It sends a message that the disabled are second-class citizens. That's a little extreme. Separate but equal is extreme. Perhaps you should talk to our disabled constituents. And that's about as far as they get before she's frustrated enough to reveal her own diagnosis. The conversation turns. There's a heavy pause while he considers whether he said anything actionable before being told. I've heard that silence personally so many times. People who need to figure out how to fire me without citing disability, how to not hire me without citing disability. You can time the silences to the moment that they find that pre-wrought script of buzzwords that they can use to explain away any discriminatory decision. But I'm getting off topic. She doesn't get approval for the ramp. She's told they should shelve the discussion until she's less tired, and she's hung up on. Her rage fuels her enough to rewrite the entire budget, where she hides the funds for the ramp in other items, and she loses control of herself. Her internal monologue drips out onto the page as she's writing up the items. Not long after, Erin lets her go because she's too emotional at this difficult time in her life. In other words, she's disabled now. It's affecting things, and she's gone. Mara survives this because she is a killer negotiator, and she got him to extend her health insurance for an extra year. That's a year that she has to figure out some other source of health insurance, a ticking clock behind everything she does. No wonder it's hard to stop working and to rest. No wonder. Disabilities are already nearly impossible to handle without the full support of the medical system, but we can't work in the same ways that abled people can. So we can't always get health insurance. So we can't always get care. So we can't work. Or live sometimes. Never mind caring for ourselves. Out of necessity, we find that liminal space between can and can't and get jobs that'll keep us alive and cause us pain and make us work and break our spirits. We push so hard just to keep going, and we hear that it's inspirational. And maybe we have friends and family to help us keep going. And that's the not fighting version. If we decide to fit enough time in to try and force society to change to give us what we need and deserve, we may end up in a 3-day coma after attending one too many conferences. I should put an aside here. I feel the need to. Talking like this makes it seem like we're not capable of having real jobs, and if we are, they'll be menial jobs that don't serve us well. We know that's not the case. There are brilliant disabled people in almost all fields, and by the end of the book, Mara is one of them again. She has education, skills, pride, connections, and more. The entire conclusion of this story is that to be disabled is not to be less than. So take everything I just said above and shake off that underlying assumption that it makes us all useless or helpless or simply in need of being saved. In fact, Mara has something to say about this. After losing her job doing research and seeing general discussions of MS online, she goes off on a tweet thread, and it's delicious. So instead of paraphrasing, I'm just gonna read out most of it here. I have multiple sclerosis. MS is not a gift sent by God to improve me. It will not make me humble. I'm not a sweet crip here to inspire you. I'm not here to be liked. I won't disguise my impairment to make you think I'm just like you. I'm not just like you. I have MS. I have a hole in my spinal cord. There is no cure, but there are plenty of drugs to choose from. Drugs that cost more per year than the median annual household income. They work if they work by mechanism unknown. All have terrible side effects. Many cause real damage. Some will kill you, but don't worry. Big Pharma will sell you drugs to treat the damage, and then drugs to treat that drug damage too. Big Pharma makes money off our backs, and AMSS makes money off Big Pharma. More than $120 million per annum. How much goes direct to people with MS? $10 million. AMSS spends the rest on useless counselors and a magazine full of big pharma ads. The AMSS exists only to perpetuate itself. We're treated as objects. We're treated as weak. We're supposed to be weak. We learn to believe we're weak. But an impairment is not something to be ashamed of. MS is not a moral blight. It's a disease. If you have MS, you are not weak. You are not a lesser being. You are not pitiful, not useless. You are real. We are real. Real people with real feelings, real desires, real thoughts. We have holes in our spines and holes in our brains, but we're still whole human beings, full citizens of society. We need money, not just for research, which all goes to big pharma anyway. We need money for living, for ramps, for wheelchairs, for vans, for meds that work, for quality of life. We don't need pity. We don't need homilies. We need action now. We face pain and battles every day that so many people can't imagine. We walk these impossible lines and survive and sometimes even thrive. But we also live in communities and cultures that fail us in dozens of ways. More than fail us. They exploit us. Sometimes we don't thrive. Sometimes we die. And we deserve better than that, especially when the problems are as basic as healthcare, as moving around public spaces, as being safe from people who would take advantage of our physical vulnerability. I can't say what's more valuable or what any given disabled person should do. Every single one of us deserves the dignity of living a life that minimizes pain and maximizes health. There's no shame in putting down work or advocacy or anything else in pursuit of that. There's also no shame in deciding that it's worth the extra pain, extra flares, and even more risk of being targeted and hurt in order to do something about this. Set up nonprofits to support each other, push for political change, the whole nine. So far, I've highlighted Mara's tendency to push herself to the brink as a flaw, but it's a strength too. She's powerful. She gets things done. But as we see, there needs to be a balance. There needs to be support. Those few pillars. So often, our lives come down to the people closest to us and what they're willing to do for us. Don't get me wrong, I know that this is the case for everyone, abled and disabled. But we've already discussed the ways in which we're a little more vulnerable, a bit more reliant on having good people around us. Unfortunately, a lot of us who became disabled later in life have the same story of isolation. Our lives bleed dry of connection faster than we can even process what's happening. Mara's boss, Mara's martial arts teacher, Mara's assistant, though he does stick around longer. Ayana is Mara's lifelong best friend with whom she just started a relationship at the beginning of the story. Throughout, in between segments and snippets of Mara's life, we see emails and chats back and forth between the two of them. They start out relatively normal, if a bit laden with awkwardness from Mara's new situation and the shift from their relationship to something more than friends. Then they grow more difficult, more terse, more infrequent. Ayana sends life updates, but Mara doesn't feel like being honest about her own. Conversations about old topics, like softball season, lead to bitterness as Mara declares distance from old things that people will just have to do for her now. Better not to be involved at all. And eventually... Hello? Hello? Are you... there? But this isn't about the people who leave us. Griffith has it down to an art, letting us in on the pain and the isolation while giving us breaths of relief at the perfect time. In the midst of losing so much, a few people rise to take up just enough of the slack to get her through each day. I haven't bothered mentioning Mara's neighbor up to this point. He's not important except to illustrate this exact concept, but she has a neighbor, and she has a lot of disdain for him. No, really, she thinks he's annoying, and his girlfriend's a ditz. And in every passing, thoughtless scene in which they're mentioned, she has a distant sense of superiority, at least up until Josh offers her some weed to try for the MS. They come talk to her and give her gifts of things that grow in their garden. She never totally loses that sense of awkwardness around them, and they never become particularly close. But Mara's haughtiness dulls into a sort of gratefulness. And as it is, these small human kindnesses are some of the only grounding that she gets. Being treated as a person, even awkwardly so, and by someone who isn't that close to her, is now a notable thing, an important thing. After collapsing in another state and being forced to stay in a new hospital, Mara meets a doctor who finally finally listens to her. He's in one scene, and only one scene, but after all the visions of Mara's usual doctor hardly listening while staring at a computer screen, it's poignant. He listens to her about her phobias, about needles and veins, about how truly deeply sickening that the treatment that she's getting is to her, and he immediately calls her doctor to fight for a change in treatment. One person in the medical field listens to her, and suddenly it's no more IVs. No more phobia-triggering treatments for a disease that grows more powerful and more painful during times of stress. I mean, you'd think doctors would think of that, but no. And then there's Rose. Rose keeps showing up. Even after the divorce and moving in with someone else, she comes to check in on Mara regularly. She flies across the country when Mara collapses. Mara never changed her emergency contact information, and she even lets Mara stay in her house when things become terrifying and overwhelming. It hardly matters that they constantly disagree, that Mara refuses to take the breaks Rose keeps telling her to, and that Rose doesn't necessarily believe the whole serial killer death thing at first.
I'm worried about you. She wiped the tear away with the heel of her hand. I read your cards. Perhaps she wanted me to ask what they said, but I didn't believe in them, and even if I did, I didn't want to know. What's happening with you? I think I'm losing my mind. I think MS is eating my brain. I think I'm hunted or haunted, but I don't believe in any of that. Belief is not data. It's not real. She put her wet hand on my wrist, anchored me.
Now, Rose isn't trying to reconcile with Mara romantically. At no point in the story is it suggesting that they're rekindling something between them. This isn't that sort of story. We're not meant to focus on anything torrid or forbidden, nor are we trying to follow the miracle of a reclamation of love during adversity in someone's life. And yet there's a trust in each other that hasn't been broken. Rose sees a need in Mara. Simply being there as a touchstone throughout the tumultuous reimagining of her life and how to live it. Well, maybe not everyone will read it this way. I believe Mara wouldn't have survived that first year without her. Like with her neighbors, like with the doctor, it all comes down to being seen and treated as a human. While the final sections of So Lucky take on an erratic tone with vacillating focus and a multitude of quick, sharp segments, the pacing slows down when Rose brings Mara to stay at her house. One of the longest sections in the whole book, 8 pages. I counted all of them, and there's only one other that comes close. And it's the two of them simply having a discussion in the kitchen. It's one of the first times Mara can talk about how she feels and thinks about her reality without being so overwhelmed she shuts down to it all.
You said to me the other day you were trying to face your fear. So, have you? No, I croaked. She just nodded. Nor have I. I don't know how. I've been reading my cards, but I'm not sure I believe them anymore. Maybe they really are just bits of pretty colored cardboard. I must have been a pain to live with. Sometimes. But she smiled. We could have been talking about 2 other people. Don't give them up, I said. If they help, don't stop. She shook her head. Not in disagreement, but the way people do when they discover something they thought was worthless was valued for a small fortune and are afraid to believe it. So now I'm the one who thinks they're just pretty pictures, and you're the one with premonitions and hunches? Life is very strange.
It's the first moment of connection in a long time, of not just being helped, but helping. Her words are effective and comforting to Rose. It's such a small, miserable moment, and yet, what would have happened if Mara hadn't done this? Rose could have lost touch with something she'd believed in for years. Instead, she does a reading for Mara only a few minutes later, and the things they speak of change and death and rebirth, are the things that Mara needs on her mind to ultimately triumph. It marks the beginning of acceptance for her. She has stopped. She has rested. She has found community. From here, Mara stops insisting on isolation. She joins a yoga group and tells herself she'll go back, even though it wasn't the least awkward thing she's ever experienced. She sends a message and makes a repair attempt with Ayana, the best friend she alienated. Believe it or not, leaning into this new shape of her life brings fulfillment. And she doesn't have to be defeated or even change who she is to do it. She just has to live the new normal, where a new set of challenges and strengths await her.
The Paranormal.
Throughout all this, I've talked around the shadow in the room. Unlike the rest of the story, this element is fantastical. Mara is plagued by a growing presence that stalks her in the solitary moments. It laughs at her from the shadows and accompanies lightning-like shocks of pain throughout her body. It takes our real-world setting and sprinkles in a little bit of horror, a little bit of paranormal. And I find it interesting that this is the one thing that Griffith decided to pull into that realm. Like many horror archetypes, this shadow figure is an embodiment of dread that we hold deep inside ourselves and struggle to articulate. But what does it symbolize really? And why, in the midst of Mara's journey with fear, helplessness, and rage, is this the thing that we need to see as the monster in the corner of the room? For now, let's go through a few appearances. Bear with me.
As evening came, shadows began to twist and sway. One detached itself from the corner of the door 15 feet away and crept towards me. I sat and watched. A person, maybe, but a stretched thin person who wasn't there, who instead of lengthening like a normal shadow, grew denser and more defined. The air above it began to thicken, as though the shadow were trying to step through reality. I licked my lips. I did not like that. My left arm fizzed tentatively. I did not like that at all. A ghost of a laugh. Oh, I really did not like that. And then my arm flashed with pain, bright as light, and I tried to move, but the pain spiked me to the chair, and again, and I could not take my eyes off that shadow reaching out to me. It's aiming to kill you! And Rip was hissing, fur raised, and I blinked. And then she was chasing her tail, and then cleaning her paw. And the shadow was just a shadow. Later, when Mara's out at a bar and she's starting to unravel physically and emotionally, she has a confrontation with a friend and ends up retreating into the bathroom, only to find that isolation does not help. A shadow fell at the bottom of my stall door, like someone peering to see if the stall was occupied. Then the door next to mine creaked. Great. An audience. Just what I needed. Time to go. A tap on the wall. Toilet paper, probably. I sighed and began to roll up a wad I could hand under the flimsy divide between us. I wish people would check before a tap on the other wall. Adrenaline washed through me, as sickening as the warmth down your leg when your bladder lets go. Another tap, and another higher up, and another. And a shadow began to coalesce on the ceiling where something was creeping up the wall to the gap. My shoulders turned to concrete. I could not move. It's seeming to kill you. I needed my stick, but if I pulled it to me, it would know I was here. It already knows you're here. I breathed, great gusts in and out, and I ran through the sequence in my head. Bend, grab the stick, pull it up and stand, pull up pants with one hand, open door, run. I bent, pulled the stick, and it pulled back so hard I nearly went over. I yanked it with two hands, crashed back into the opposite wall, scrabbled at the door, and bolted. Silky laughter followed me as I burst into the main room, eyes staring, shirt hanging out, and pants askew. Outside, the night was warm, but I couldn't stop shivering.
Now, this shadow monster did not stalk Mara until she got her MS diagnosis. At first, it seems to be a representation of MS itself, but the final confrontation refutes that fact. And don't worry, I'll get to it. But I want to linger here for a while. You see, when analyzing these things, we often intellectualize, analyze, and categorize it all without stopping to really feel the emotions behind it. We don't linger on the meat of it. Right now, we're in the midst of the dread. We're alone in the dark in our house at night, watching danger slowly crawling towards us. We're stuck in a bathroom stall with something lurking outside, wondering if we have enough control of our legs to stand and run the few feet to safety. It's not a man with a gun. It's not something we can fight. If the shadow reaches us, we don't even fully know what's going to happen. Will we survive it? Will we want to by the time it's done? Is there any use telling other people? Imagine a quiet dread that's almost a calmness, pulling you down and down and down until you break. Maybe I'm projecting. I'm definitely projecting, but it's not because I'm not reading this clearly. In Mara's description, I understood the exact same monster that hides in my room. It's the thing that threatens to swallow me when I'm flaring and my body hurts for no damn reason. It's the looming reality that blots out hope when nothing feels like it will ever be normal again. It's the leash on my tongue when I'm losing control and I know that no one will listen. This shadow is the seed inside us that fights that new normal with every inch of its life. It's the shame and self-destruction of our grief spiral. The voice of the world telling us that we are less than is bad enough, but when that certainty latches onto our insides, we've already lost. In the end, the police catch the men that have been traveling and killing. She can finally live in relief that the monsters are gone. Or can she?
That's when I heard the whisper.
You'll never be free.
What? I sat up, but there was no one there, and the house was silent.
You'll never be free of me.
It came from the living room. Brip wasn't on the bed. The Ruger had disappeared.
Just you and me, and you'll never be free.
Outside the door, a low laugh.
You and me.
The whisper hissed like dead leaves against the floor. There was no other sound. I couldn't hear my own heartbeat, my breathing. The door began to open outward, the wrong way. And from the shadow crept a hand, a wrist, a forearm, a shoulder. Glimmer of pale ribs. And I doubt you'll stop it. I closed my eyes. No. Yes. And the whisper was in my room. It was in my room. I opened my eyes and looked. Hello, it said. It was naked and lean and strong, and it was me. It smiled, wide, wider, like a pat of butter melting in a skillet, and it had too many teeth.
Finally, in that moment it all seems like it'll be okay. Mara hears a whisper from the corner. It tells her she will never be free. Laughing at her despair, the monster looms and stalks her. Then, she fights it.
No, I said. No, you want me to run. It wanted me to hide, to be afraid. No, you want me to be ashamed. I see you, I said. I know what you are. And I did. This was not MS. This was helplessness and self-loathing and second-class citizenship. It was the story of what is to be a cripple in the world, relying on the kindness of strangers, feeling seen only as a target, seeing yourself as a target because that's how people saw you. Break the narrative.
She recognizes it for what it is, shame and fear, and she fights it. Instead of running, she meets it and holds it to her, and she squeezes it until it becomes her, until it's a part of her, until she is hugging herself alone and safe in her room. Everything that she's run from and held away from herself, she accepts. Her disability is a part of her, and so is the fear and the reality that comes with it. So is the pain and the medication and the brain fog and the knowledge that she's not lesser for any part of it. Griffith made this the monster, this, out of everything else, because it is the inescapable truth. It's impossible to describe accurately with rational words, unknowable unless you've known it. It's easy to express anger and defiance that others can empathize with, but pain is something else. We all understand the dreadful paranormal, though. We've grown up with it. By externalizing this deep-set shame, Griffith has done the most important thing, communicated the core of her work with sharp clarity. In the end, we can choose for ourselves whether we believe that in this fictional world of Mara's there really is some phantom magic element, or maybe it's just narrative symbolism for Mara's perception of herself and others, and internal work in that dark room alone. Finally, accepting yourself is a battle, after all.
I am not invincible, but I am not less. I refuse that story. I'll fight it. I'll teach others to fight it, teach self-defense. I'll teach them from a wheelchair if I have to. I'll even teach the oldest woman in the world with MS. And she'll teach me. She already has. So, the story, and less, and MS. No. They should be so lucky.
Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, I can only imagine I've done something right. This is far from the only story I want to cover. I plan on doing video games, shows, heavy topics, and lighthearted analyses. I have a lot of thoughts about stories and just want to get them out. So if that feels like a good time to you, consider subscribing. Salve Veritate.